My theory on what does it mean to be black. As I was making some of these identity series videos and really distinguishing the difference between identity and ethnicity, you are not your racial identity, etc. I started to think more deeper in how it can be misleading to people who I have a master's degree in marriage and family therapy. I graduated in 2017. So I was a dedicated psychology student who has experience and years under my belt under just doing various counseling and studies and work in this particular field. So when I'm providing information and knowledge on these particular topics, I also have to be mindful that the audience that I'm speaking to may not necessarily share the same academic history or understanding. And your academic learning is different than just your experiential learning. But I thought about it. I said, maybe some people, it can be hard to wrap your mind around if I'm a black man or a black woman, but then he's saying you are not your race or this idea is not a reality, but the realities and the consequences that I'm dealing with around my race is a reality for me. What does that, how do you bridge this? And this theory that I'm working on is not an original idea. So this is by any means not trying to take credit for all the years and years of work from my ancestors and pioneers in the science community, particularly the African American leaders and the work that they've done in this area, in this research. I'm trying to, as much as I can, pull from a lot of their studies and their work and trying to put a cohesive theory together for the Black youth and the future generations on what do we mean when we say I'm Black or I'm a Black man, because that means different things for different people. So I typed out some thoughts into ChatGPT that were my original thoughts on what I believe the difficulty and the challenges with identifying as Black and what Black means. So I just wanted to share this. So I typed into ChatGPT, Black refers to the skin color of a human being, but it also is symbolic in that it represents historical experience and conditions reoccurring around themes of trauma, oppression, and ongoing fights against systems, individuals, and ideologies intent on erasing the prosperity and welfare of such persons. Because of this, this symbology has taken on a form of identity that otherwise might not have been necessary if it had been conditions where Black, quote unquote, might not have held any significant meaning to those responding to their own individual discomforts. In a sense, this identity has become powerful in that it's the discomfort of others that gave the identity legs more than anything. So that present day humans who find themselves born into this racial quote unquote Black group by consequence of their positioning to others who are not so, by necessity find themselves in a drive to bridge two identities, one of which is a product of social engineering in prioritizing one's safety, and the other on any interest the individual might have that is not hinged upon the responses and discomfort of others. So I asked ChatGPT to build on this premise to formulate a possible theory on Blackness. When we say we're Black, how unique that is from whiteness. And the reason is because individuals who are born Black, specifically Black American, they're faced with the challenge of having two identities. One that is basically built on the idea of having to protect and prioritize their safety in response to other people's discomfort. And then another that's built on what they want for themselves as individuals. So it's almost like an identity. One is built on consequence, and the other is built on the person's individual merit. One identity is based on the other one is based on the self. And how do I bridge these two? And how these two realities interact differently amongst different Black groups explains a lot. And this is also why the Black experience is different from the white experience, because the symbolism and the oppression isn't the same when a white person exists, especially if they're in an environment where it's good to be white. It's acceptable to be white. It's rewarding to be white. The legs of the identity responding to the consequence is not the same as it is for the Black person. So that white person has more time to focus on their own individual interests, because they don't have to focus so much on that second identity that's in response to the other. So they have more of the luxury of sharpening sort of like their own independent ideologies, so and interests. So ChatGPT did a really good job of breaking this down. And I just want to share this. So it says, your premise can be developed into a coherent theory of racial identity. Blackness as both an externally imposed social position and an internally negotiated identity. Because I noticed with foster kids and kids who are being adopted into these white families, it was hard for them to kind of understand who they are. And it's hard for the parents to connect to their experiences. And not even just that, even Black people who have been born into Black families. Each of us is so different and unique. And that's in large part, it's because they may not have had the same relationship to consequence of being Black like others may have. For the dark skinned people, they might have had, and even brown skin or light skin, but just based on their particular experiences, they might have had such a high degree of exposure to the consequence of just existing that they had to create and form an identity around that. You know, who do I have to be in order to survive the consequence, right? I have to create a sense of self that can respond to what I'm up against. And then there's another half of them that's like, okay, now I can create something that's for me. And since each of us experiences the consequences differently, that first identity that's off of the other is going to respond differently to everybody else's first identity. Because I truly believe with this theory I want to create, that the first identity is the identity that it responds to the opposition from others first, because your safety comes first. And so I will call that quote unquote like your first identity. This sense of who do I need to be or who do I have to become in order to prioritize my safety and to navigate just the discomfort of other people, navigate this socially engineered response to who I am. So the important distinction in what you are proposing is that the social significance of Black, quote unquote, does not originate simply from pigmentation. It develops because societies repeatedly responded to people classified as Black in ways that made the classification consequential. Over generations, people then had to develop identities, institutions, cultural practices, protective strategies, and forms of solidarity, partly in response to those conditions. So I had them rewrite it and to kind of clean it up a little bit. AI does a really good job in cleaning up your original ideas. And no idea is original, but just some of the work. Like I said, this I am not the originator of this theory or of this work. There are pioneers, there are doctors, there are lecturers that are, intellectuals in the diaspora, in the African community, the African American community, who have spoken on these things. I guess I just want to champion and continue the legacy of their work by pulling it together into a cohesive theory. So, Black refers at its most literal level to a socially recognized range of human skin pigmentation. Yet, Black, quote unquote, has acquired a symbolic meaning extending far beyond physical appearance. It carries historical experiences and recurring social conditions involving enslavement, racial hierarchy, exclusion, trauma, oppression, resistance, cultural creation, and continuing struggles against systems. Individuals and ideologies perceived or demonstrated to threaten the prosperity, dignity, safety, and welfare of people categorized as Black. Because these experiences have repeatedly been organized around racial classification, Blackness has developed into a meaningful social identity that might not have taken the same form under conditions in which physical differences carried little consequence. In this sense, Black identity cannot be understood solely by examining Black people themselves. It must also be understood by examining the societies that continually made Blackness significant. And this is what I believe is sort of taps into a divine narrative that I won't spend too much time going into, because what it means to be Black to others is so significant. And in my opinion, it becomes divine when it taps into such a broad array of different groups and entities and human beings who may not even have any proximity to Black people, yet that Blackness still means something to them. So that's where I believe it taps into a divine narrative because of just such of a impact that it has on individuals who are non-Black, and the responses that are so out of proportion, especially when you're dealing with a righteous Black person, and the responses that they receive just from being Black, not necessarily doing anything to bring any harm on themselves, cannot be understood naturally from the human understanding. So it goes into divine territory when it supersedes sort of like your human comprehension of why are these things happening this way. So it says this suggests a paradox. Much of the historical power attached to Black identity originated not simply from how Black people understood themselves, but from how other people responded to them. Fear, prejudice. So this is that first identity, that identity that has to sort of grow legs and prepare itself for the response. So that first identity that Black people have to sort of co-create is the identity that's ready for the response. So it says here fear, prejudice, economic interest, social hierarchy, stereotypes, laws, segregation, discrimination, and other forms of racial boundary making repeatedly communicated that being classified as Black matter. So this is for the child, right? When children grow up, and a lot of times you'll see children playing with white kids, Asian kids, Hispanic kids. They're not at a young age, like my 2 year old, when she goes out, she's not thinking in her mind like, oh, I can't hang out with these white kids because that's majority that's there. I can't hang out with these Hispanic kids. So they don't have that exposure or even that concept or understanding of the weight and the response of others to how they look or what they look like. As far as they're concerned, it's just, play. It's just the beauty of play to the child mind. All right. It's not until the degree and the weight of the response from others holds significance that that first identity is formed. Why are people responding to me this way? I was just hanging out with Jack and Jill the other day. Why are Jack and Jill not returning my calls? Why are they, acting funny when I come around? Their friends are looking at me crazy. What's going on? That's the formulation of that first identity, that response identity. The discomfort of others therefore helped give the category legs. Once society consistently organizes consequences around a physical characteristic, people possessing that characteristic cannot simply behave as though the category does not exist. What may have begun as an externally imposed classification can consequently become an internally meaningful identity because people must understand, anticipate, resist, reinterpret, or survive the conditions associated with that classification. So here is the sophistication of that first identity. The function of it is to help the person, the human being, understand, anticipate, resist, reinterpret. It's almost like the soul is sitting in a spaceship and it's sort of telling itself, okay, I'm in this black body. I got to have a part of me or an identity that can respond to this environment that I'm sort of getting feed from in a way where I can understand, anticipate, resist, reinterpret, or survive conditions associated with how they perceive me as and what this means to them. A person born today into the racial category called Black therefore inherits more than a description of appearance. They enter an already existing network of meanings, expectations, historical narratives, stereotypes, cultural traditions, collective memories, and assumptions about what their appearance supposedly signifies. Before the individual has had sufficient opportunity to determine who they are, that's the second identity. Society may already possess narratives about who they are expected to be. The individual therefore faces an identity development problem. They must distinguish between the self they discover through living and the racial self they learn to navigate because society has made race consequential. This can create what might be called a dual identity demand. One dimension of identity becomes concerned with racial positioning, understanding stereotypes, recognizing potential threats, interpreting discrimination, maintaining cultural belonging, protecting oneself, and responding to the expectations of people who perceive the individual through racial categories. The other dimension concerns aspects of personhood that need not originate from race at all: the individual's spirituality, personality, relationships, talents, curiosities, profession, creativity, moral commitments, interests, dreams, temperament, and personal values. And this is the second identity that many white people get to come in contact with, and they have more time to produce because they don't have that time taken away from having to produce that first identity that's responding to the social consequence of them being white. White people were smart enough to know that if we can create, and smart is subjective, if we can create as many conditions in the environment as possible to prevent them having to go into this dual identity state, then, especially the identity in response to others, if we can make an artificial other where they're celebrated being white, they're praised being white, they're rewarded for being white, that's less time of them creating an identity that is engineered towards responding to the environment and taking away time for them to think about their relationships, their talents, their profession, their creativity. They're more so since they don't have to worry about, I have more time, to focus on my relationships as a white person, my personality. I can sharpen certain characteristics, certain skills, my articulate ability, my orator ability. I can explore my curiosities, my profession, right? White privilege at its root is just the dualism that occurs in Black people being reduced, where white people they have the luxury of focusing on their personhood and not an identity that's constructed in response to the consequence of being white. They have the luxury of, investing in engineering their personhood, where African Americans have, limited time to build their personhood and engineer and manufacture an identity to the consequence at the same time. You don't have much time on this earth. So it says the challenge is not necessarily to eliminate racial consciousness, because awareness may remain adaptive in a racialized environment. Rather, the challenge is preventing an identity originally made necessary by external social conditions from acquiring total authority over the definition of the self. So, the burden that Black people have today is, how can I, as I'm, focusing on the importance of having an identity that is prioritizing my safety, that understands protecting myself, that responds to, that is able to navigate skillfully in managing these responses and meanings of other people who I have absolutely no control over. How can I set boundaries around this first identity, okay, that's born out of the consequence of what you mean to other people from consuming my entire self or personhood? Okay, so that's the challenge. Okay. The theory therefore proposes that racial identity contains a feedback loop. Society assigns meaning to physical difference. Those meanings produce consequences. People adapt to those consequences. Adaptations become shared narratives, behaviors, institutions, and cultural memories. Subsequent generations inherit those meanings. The inherited identity influences how new experiences are interpreted. Eventually, the identity can become self sustaining even when particular individuals did not personally experience the historical events responsible for its formation. So a lot of times when you're talking to Black people today, based off of this theory that I'm cohesively putting together from the greats who went before me, a lot of times when you're talking to Black people, depending on what conditions that they're in, you don't know which self or identity you're talking to. And a lot of times, if the person has experienced a significant amount of oppression, discrimination, you might only come in contact with that first identity that's built off the meanings and in response to the conditions for their safety, because safety first. You might not even get to tap into the person's personhood, and you're blessed to get into that space if they even let you in. It just depends on how all consuming that first identity is. Um, so this does not make the identity artificial or the historical experiences unreal. Instead, it demonstrates how socially constructed categories can become psychologically and culturally real through repeated human experience. So I'll close with this because I have a lot of information. The deeper question becomes one of identity sovereignty, okay, with Black people having these two identities. Who ultimately possesses the authority to define the individual? A Black person can recognize history, participate in Black culture, oppose racism, protect themselves from legitimate threats, and maintain solidarity with other Black people without requiring racial classification to become the organizing principle of their entire existence. Under this framework, psychological freedom does not require pretending that race has no social consequences. It involves developing the ability to distinguish between what you must know because of the world you inhabit and who you fundamentally understand yourself to be. The ultimate developmental task is therefore integration, acknowledging the racialized environment without allowing the environment's racial categories, whether imposed through hostility, solidarity, fear, or expectation, to completely determine the boundaries of the self. You guys have a blessed night. I love you guys. I feel like this is meant for who it's meant for. I'll do more videos on this. I'm trying to create a theory for Black people that can speak to